Today about brain health, keeping the lights on. Quick introduction. I think most of you have already been on some of my talks. So you know that I am a clinical social worker. I'm the older adult behavioral health specialist for Lynn and Benton counties, and I come to you today with a little over 20 years of experience in the medical, social, and human service fields. Learning objectives for today. We're going to begin by talking about what I mean when I say cognition. So this will include all the different kind of elements within this concept of cognition. So different functions within the brain and how those functions contribute to specific behaviors or abilities that we need to be successful in life and to live independently, things like that. Next, we'll talk about aging of the brain, what some normal things are with aging of the brain, some non-normative things that can happen to the brain that impact cognition. We'll just briefly look at a slide about why it's important to talk about brain health and why it's important to, as soon as possible, start actively taking this on to, take care of your brain just the same way you take care of any other aspect of health. And then lastly, we'll look at specific guidelines that you can do and implement into your life to increase your brain health. Some of them you probably are already doing. There might be some, hopefully there will be some new things that you haven't thought of or haven't implemented in your life that you can take and start to put forward. So cognition, this slide is built based off of the DSM, which is what clinical social workers use. It's the way that we diagnose things, and it provides us with this framework at looking at what cognition means. So there are 6 domains within cognition, and we break them down into the different chunks so that you can better conceptualize what brain processes and functions, things like that, are attached to each one. So I'll go through each one briefly, and then I'll try to give you at least an example or two of what that domain looks like as far as functioning. The first one is executive functioning. And if you've ever had a family friend or worked with people who are on the autism spectrum, you might have heard the phrase executive functioning. They talk about this a lot because it's usually impacted to some degree, sometimes really heavily, within folks who are on the autism spectrum. This level of functioning, or this domain, really involves complex planning. It involves reasoning, and it involves problem solving. So if you have a cognitive deficit, or you get a particular brain disease or brain injury where your executive functioning is diminished or disabled in some way, you're not going to do a great job at being able to plan. So what this looks like is sometimes people won't get to places on time. They can't manage their time. They can't really work through a problem-solving task very easily. So executive functioning is really, really important. The next domain is language. So we have a label or a name or a word for everything in our world. So language includes being able to name the items, everything in the world that we use, and then our ability to find appropriate words. So this then leads into fluency, verbal fluency, being able to find the words and put them together appropriately to be able to speak with an appropriate level of fluency, and then also being able to understand heard or read language. So we see deficits within this domain of cognition when someone is living with a brain disease like Alzheimer's or a different type of dementia. Alzheimer's absolutely affects this language domain, usually towards the middle and later stages of the disease, but it's kind of one of those hallmark features of Alzheimer's. The next domain is social cognition. So within this domain, we see kind of where we store all of the information about what is socially appropriate. So this can vary a little bit based on kind of where you grow up, social and cultural norms. But in general, an example would be if you have something that's impacting social cognition, you might leave the house without putting pants on. Okay, so you'll see some of these socially inappropriate or bizarre behaviors when you have diminished cognition within that social domain. So one disease, brain disease that really impacts social cognition is called Lewy body dementia. So sometimes you'll see folks acting really bizarre, or, you know, like I said, leaving the house without pants on or anything like that. Just because that part of the brain is really heavily impacted. And that's the part that stores kind of all of our rules, our social rules and norms for what is appropriate. This also impacts decision-making. So not only being able to make a decision, but also making appropriate decisions. The other interesting thing about social cognition is that this is where our ability to be empathic comes from. So being able to show, experience empathy. So this is something that oftentimes does get misinterpreted. So sometimes if someone you're interacting with comes across maybe as mean or a very flat affect, meaning they're not really showing an appropriate emotion at the time, or sometimes even they're showing an opposite emotion from what you would expect socially from that person, this could mean that there's something impacting their social cognition. So they're not reading you correctly or reading a situation correctly. And so sometimes people are like, oh, they're just really mean, or they don't really care. And sometimes, especially with things like dementia or traumatic brain injury, this can just impact our ability to experience empathy. And the last piece is appropriate recognition of emotions, or correct recognition of emotions. So that's why you might have somebody who responds in a bizarre way, or really kind of opposite, like they're laughing when something's really scary or really sad. It could be that there's, you know, brain damage or trauma that impacts that specific domain of cognition. The next piece is learning and memory. So this involves learning new things, but then also retaining that information and being able to withdraw that information when we need it. So if we have cognitive decline or anything that diminishes that particular domain, we're going to have trouble learning new things. We might in the moment be able to pick up information and stay present while we're learning it, but you will have trouble then retrieving that information at a later time. So you just don't have that remembering piece. This is another common aspect that we see with cognition being impacted by things like Alzheimer's or any other type of dementia. You see impact on learning and memory. The fifth domain is complex attention. So this is impacting our ability to maintain attention in whatever it is that we're actively trying to focus on. And then the other piece is that we're able to focus on something and kind of sort out all the other stimuli that are happening around us. So I'm sitting in front of a window talking to you right now. It's garbage day. If I had cognitive deficit within the complex attention domain, when that garbage truck comes by, or if I hear a sound outside, or, you know, one of my dogs starts barking behind me, I would be drawn to those other things that are happening around me, and I wouldn't be able to continue with what I'm doing. So I would either have to stop speaking and recollect myself and refocus, or I might just, you know, really struggle to maintain attention. So the last cognitive domain is perceptual motor function, and this involves all of our motor tasks. Okay, so anything from fine motor skills to, you know, those larger motor skills that we do. Recognition of faces is one of the interesting components of this cognitive domain. And I think this is one of the more painful features of things like Alzheimer's disease. A lot of times people say, you know, I went to see mom today, she has Alzheimer's, and she doesn't know who I am anymore. So a couple things can be, you know, playing a part within that. If we look at the language domain, she may know who you are. She may have forgot your label, which is daughter, or, you know, Cindy, or whatever the label is that she has for you. She might have lost the recognition of your face, which is under the perceptual motor function. Or it may be a learning and memory. So she may have lost piece of that. She would probably remember younger daughter memories, but not new daughter memories. The last piece of perceptual motor function is hand-eye coordination. So being able to coordinate, okay, and sending those brain messages back and forth from the brain to all the body parts that move. So this can be where we really see deficits with someone who maybe looks physically like everything's intact, but you see them no longer be able to brush hair or undo a button or things like that, because they're not able to communicate from the brain to the fingers and the hands anymore what you want it to do. So those are the 6 domains of cognition. I want to give you this framework and this groundwork ahead of time so that as we look at things that happen to the brain, why it's so important to try to preserve all of these different categories of functioning. So looking at causes of cognitive impairment. So anytime we see a decrease in functioning within one of those areas of cognition. So any of these can range from mild to severe. So in between there would be moderate. And some impairments can occur after a stroke. So there are a lot of different levels of stroke severity. It can be a very minor stroke. Sometimes they happen and we don't even know that we've experienced a stroke. We might not have any cognitive impairment or such subtle impairment that you wouldn't even really notice, all the way to a very big stroke that can leave people physically paralyzed. It can leave people without speech, things like that. And sometimes those big strokes can leave us really heavily impaired. And then we usually give about 6 months. I think that's still the standard from an event like that. You've got 6 months from that time of the event where you can see a lot of changes and improvement and regaining that cognitive functioning. So traumatic brain injury is another cause of cognitive impairment. Traumatic brain injury, we just call it TBI. It can look like you got into a fender bender and you bumped your head against the steering wheel on impact and it bruised part of your brain, or you had a brain bleed that was temporary but has healed. It can look like a permanent brain injury with something more significant. It can even be due to swelling of the brain. Traumatic brain injury for older adults can also occur when we have a fall. So it doesn't even necessarily mean that that individual, when they fall, that they hit their head on the ground. This can happen even when the individual falls and on impact, maybe their hip goes down and their head rocks really jarring from side to side, and the brain can actually bump into the skull and create a traumatic brain injury. So a lot of times these things heal, and in some circumstances they leave us with permanent cognitive impairments. The next one is Alzheimer's disease. This is our most common type of dementia. And this is something that if you are diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease, it is fatal. So this is something that is progressive and will gradually rob a person of their cognitive abilities in all domains. The ones that I highlighted when we looked at the different domains of cognition, you'll see those impacted at different stages. The next piece is medication side effects. So if you've ever taken a medication and you notice that your brain feels kind of foggy, or you're unable to find words, your speech is impacted, anything like that, most of the time they are not going to be permanent. But in some situations, if it's not identified that it's a medication causing it and you don't come off of that medication, sometimes you can be left with a little bit of a permanent impairment. The next piece is really looking at mental health and how that can impact cognitive functioning. So we're looking primarily at depression. Sometimes people will come to me and they might be worried that they have some type of dementia. They'll feel kind of foggy in the brain, or that they can't really remember things. They have trouble finding their words. They're forgetting appointments, all sorts of different things. It can feel a lot like dementia. It can look a lot like dementia, but all of those things are actually symptoms of depression as well. So that's why it's really important to make sure that you get to your primary care doctor or a mental health professional when you first notice an onset of any cognitive impairments, and they're going to take a look at all of these things to rule out any medical or physical health causes before we look at mental health. The other thing that can cause cognitive impairment is vitamin B12 deficiency. There are other vitamin and mineral deficiencies that can create cognitive impairments. B12 is one of the main hitters in there. So again, going to your primary care doctor and getting, kind of that physical health evaluation. They can do blood work. They can look at all the different things. Sometimes it's as simple as taking a vitamin and getting that balanced out, and you'll see that cognitive impairment go away and you'll regain functioning. So when does our cognition peak? Okay, so this is thinking about in the human lifespan, at what age approximately are we functioning at our highest ability? I did a lot of research. I looked at a lot of studies, and most people agree that cognitive brain functioning and performance is at its highest around age 40. Okay. And then after age 40, very gradually, we see the onset of normal age-related decline in cognitive functioning. So some people get kind of alarmed at that, like, oh, I'm 60 years old or I'm 70 years old. Does that mean, cognitively I'm not functioning very well? We don't really see a noticeable change for the most part until much later than 40 years. So starting in the 60s, you might notice some things have changed a little bit with how sharp you might feel in certain things. The reason why that is because it's just a subtle age-related decline, okay? And then also by age 40 and on, we've become very good at compensating. We have a lot of tools. So if you notice that it's harder for you to remember things as you go on, it might not even occur to you why, or that you're having more difficulty. You might just go and get a fresh stack of sticky notes and start using a sticky note system, or start keeping a written planner, or start setting alarms on your cell phone. Okay, so we are really good at compensating for any kind of decline that causes us distress or makes it hard for us to do what we need to do. So it's not really anything to worry about. It's just something to keep in mind. So now looking at how the brain changes, these are normal age-related changes. So all of these bullet points I'm going to go through briefly will happen to all of our brains relatively around the same time for most of us, but there are some different lifestyle and genetic factors that, maybe I'm going to go through some of these changes at a different age than the next person. But in general, it's pretty similar for most brains as they age. The first part is that certain parts of the brain will shrink. So literally the volume of that matter in the brain is going to decrease. And it's specifically those parts of the brain that are linked to learning and other complex mental activities. Okay, so learning might feel more challenging as we get older, but it does not mean that we cannot learn. The next piece is neuroinflammation may increase, and it generally will increase if you're not doing everything you can to manage that. So neuroinflammation is just a fancy way of saying inflammation in the brain. Blood flow in the brain may decrease, okay? So one of the things to think about within normal brain changes is that as we age, things just start to dry a little bit. So thinking about that, when I said you can get a traumatic brain injury if you have a fall as an older person, and maybe your head doesn't even hit the ground, but it bonks against the inside of your skull. The reason that it becomes more likely that you might experience that as you get older is because all of the protective fluid that surrounds our brain, and then it provides that barrier in between the brain and the skull, that starts to dry a little bit and diminish. Okay, so it's going to be easier for your brain to bonk against the inside of your skull. The next piece is that communication between the neurons, which is a fancy way of saying nerve cells, can be reduced in some regions of the brain. So that just means that kind of the messaging back and forth between nerve cells will start to decrease. The last piece is that we see changes in neurotransmitters and hormones within the brain. And this is vague because it is so different within each brain. So why does brain health matter? Why do we have a PowerPoint about this? Why do I try to educate people on this? It's not surprising that this is one of my most popular talks. I think as we see, and we have seen over the last couple decades, such a terrifying increase of Alzheimer's disease, and not a lot of headway being made on, finding a cure or treatment. A lot of us are worried about that because physically, with all these advances in technology and medicine, healthcare, we can stay alive with our physical bodies, remaining intact and pretty high functioning for a very long time. I think what scares a lot of us is, will I be stuck in my body that's working pretty well and have my brain start to fail on me? If you've ever had a loved one or caregiven for anyone that's, lived or passed away from a brain disease like Alzheimer's, it's terribly unpleasant. So a lot of people are worried about that. And so I think in turn, a lot of people really want to know what's in my control. We know that some people are genetically more predisposed or more likely to develop Alzheimer's disease or other dementias, but there's actually a lot that we can control with the way that we care for our brain. So brain health matters because our brains and our brain functioning is a vital part of healthy aging. It also means the difference between, being able or not able to care for yourself. Ultimately, it impacts the quality of our life and may determine whether we're able to live independently if that's something that we choose. So we talked a lot about the problem and what can go wrong with our brains, how it changes as we age. So now we're going to talk about what we can do. So some of these things are about preserving current cognitive functioning, current brain health, and others of these are really about what can you do to increase the health of your brain. So learning something new, very, very important. I know there's, a saying that's been around a long time. It's very ageist, and it's about old dogs can't learn new tricks. Well, I don't know about you, but I've had several old dogs in my life, and I can tell you they can learn new tricks up until the very end. And the same is true for humans. So research suggests that we are able to learn new things and create new nerve cells up until the very ends of our lifespan, which that wasn't something that we were certain of until fairly recently. So when we learn something new, we create new neuronal synapses, which means that we create new nerve cells, and then they also were creating new lines of messaging between those nerve cells, which if you think about the slide where I showed you normal age-related changes, I talked about a decrease in communication between nerve cells. And so this helps kind of keep putting more in reserve so that you can kind of accommodate to that natural decline that we'll see. When I was doing research to build this PowerPoint many, many years ago, I came across a blog that a woman had written, and I think she either had been diagnosed with dementia or she had somebody in her life that had been diagnosed. And she had a funny saying that I still remember. She said, the more you have to lose when you lose it. And she was talking about creating this reserve of nerve cells. And so I think of it as like, our little squirrels that go out and they collect this big reserve of food so that they can make it through the winter. And so if you think about learning something new, if you keep challenging your brain, you can create this little stash for yourself so that as your brain does go through normal age-related changes, you have a lot more as far as backup goes. So the more you have to lose before you lose it. The next thing is that higher education at any age is shown to be protective of the brain. So this does not mean higher education like you all need to go out and enroll in medical school after we get off the talk. It just means that learning something new, it could be taking a class, a community education class through Lynn Benton or Oregon State. They all have satellite locations for the colleges, and everything now, especially because of the coronavirus, is available online. If you go through the community education courses, you are not required to, enroll in the school as other full-time students would be required to do. Some of these they have scholarships for. It could be learning a new language, learning how to use that fancy tablet you have that you've never figured out, learning how to do floral arranging. It doesn't have to be anything specific. The one thing to know about learning something new A lot of times people say, oh, so if I do word find puzzles or crosswords or Sudoku, does that count? It doesn't count. So those things are very fun and for a very long time. And I'm sure some people are still going out there saying, you know, do crossword puzzles and it's protective for your brain. There's not a lot of support for that. It's fun. It can kill some time. But in general, to get the protective effect of this, it needs to be challenging for your brain. It needs to be new information. Okay. So if you already love to dance and you know several different styles, learning something new would look like that you take a class or, you know, watch YouTube videos and you learn a new variation of dance. If you already, you know how to cook, you would have to learn a new style of cooking. So something that's going to kind of challenge your brain. Just like in the gym, if you always run, you know, a half mile every single day and that's what you do, that's great. That's good exercise, it's good maintenance, but you have to take it a step further, either challenge with a new activity or take it a step further as far as intensity. The next piece is that we need to get rest. So if you've already been to my sleep hygiene class, you know that sleep and good quality sleep more specifically becomes very elusive as we age, and that's a pretty normal thing. But we still need to work as hard as we can to get good rest and the right amount of it. So what happens when we shut down our brains for rest or sleep is that basically a cleaning crew comes into our brains. They sweep, they mop, they organize all the things that we took in that day, and they clear out all the different toxins that are floating around in there. So if we don't find a good amount of time to wind down, then our cleaning crew never shows up to work. It's very, very important for memory because, like I said, not only with the cleaning crew, they come in, but they organize and they file away all the new information that you took in during that day, sometimes even things that we're not really aware of. It organizes it. If we don't have that, you know, you can think of her as a receptionist or a filing clerk. If she doesn't show up that night because you didn't get any rest, then you're not going to be able to retain that information. You're not going to be able to retrieve the information like you would. If you've ever gone through a really significant loss, grieving period, if you've dealt with clinical depression, things like that, you've probably noticed that your memory was very much impacted. And at least part of that is because sleep is usually heavily impacted when we go through something like that. So we have to try to get at least 6 to 8 hours of sleep per night. That is the average. 6 to 8 hours of sleep is the same whether you are 22, whether you are 82, okay? So the only people that need different amounts of sleep on average are kiddos. Everybody else from young adulthood on needs about the same amount of sleep. If you are one of those people that says, you know, I've never needed more than 4 hours, please do not lay down and try to get double because I'm telling you that right now. So you are the expert on your own, you know, need for sleep. But for most of us, it's going to be between the 6 and 8 hour mark. It is okay as an older adult to supplement rest with naps. Like I said, sleep is more challenging as we get older. And what that means is it can be more challenging to get asleep, fall asleep, stay asleep, go back to sleep, okay? But not only that, we see changes in the stages of sleep that we spend the majority of our time in. So maybe you fall asleep for 4 hours, but you're not going to spend the same amount of time in that REM stage, which is the really restorative sleep stage. A 22-year-old person, if they slept for 4 hours, they're going to get more REM than an 82-year-old person, okay? So it's okay if you're getting the same time period of sleep as you used to, but you notice you're feeling more tired. It's because that's actually changed in where your brain is at in the stages. You'll spend more time in the lighter stages of sleep. So supplementing with very intentional nap periods. You want to try to do this earlier in the day than later. Certainly not close to when you'd like to lie down and go to sleep for the night. You want to be mindful that you're not just passing out on the couch like these folks, if you can see the image here. You want to try to go to a place that's appropriate to take a nap, whether it's in your bedroom, lying down on the couch, you know, create a cool, dark area that is quiet and peaceful, just like you would when you go to sleep for the night. And then make sure that you don't go overboard. I know some people that can lay down, set an alarm for 15 minutes, and they take power naps. It takes me about an hour to fall asleep. So for me, 15 minutes would just probably make me feel worse. But again, I need to make sure that I set an alarm so that I don't take a nap for probably more than 2 hours, because then you're going to feel kind of off when you get up. And again, you don't want to get too close to bedtime. We need to manage our stress. So on the normative age-related changes, I talked about neuroinflammation, inflammation in the brain. So stress registers in our body and our brains as inflammation. Okay. Another interesting thing that I learned when I was researching for this talk is that exposure to pollen and allergens registers as inflammation to our brain. Okay. So thinking about all these other things that we think are totally separate, non-related, depending on how the brain and the body, basically sees those stressors, it can mean inflammation. And for a million different reasons, we need to try to keep inflammation down in our body and brain. So acute, which is short-term or brief, and chronic long-term stress, even if it's chronic, very low-level stress, but it's just ongoing for a very long time, it's going to increase inflammation in your brain. So we need to make stress-reducing activities part of our daily routine. Okay, it cannot be an optional thing. You can't have this mindset where you say, if I get time with all my things that I need to do and get the laundry done and go do my errands and things like that, then maybe I will, put a puzzle together, or maybe I'll read that book, or maybe I'll do some yoga or some stretching. It has to be just as much of a priority as all your other things, because if you don't make it a priority and part of your routine, it will be one of the first things that gets cut. So deep breathing techniques are a great option. If you've never learned how to do deep breathing techniques, you can email or call Rebecca and she can let me know. She might even have it still on her computer, but I have a handout that talks about 4 different types of breathing techniques, and this can really be helpful for managing stress and resetting the brain. The next thing is staying engaged. Keep in mind, I've been doing this PowerPoint and this talk for a very long time, and this is the first time that we're doing it during a pandemic. So some of these things are not as easy to do at this time. So loneliness and isolation register as stressors. I'm sure you've already noticed. Being, in a pandemic, being isolated from everyone, it is very, very stressful for the body and brain. So we want to try to avoid social isolation by making sure that we work as hard as we can to stay connected to a social network, whatever that means for you. If your social network is a couple friends or family members, or if it's, all of those things in a volunteer, position or a job or things like that, doing whatever you can to keep meaningful social connections in your life. If you don't already volunteer, there's always opportunities to do that, even during a pandemic. Making phone calls, doing outreach work from your home, anything like that. So thinking about what things are meaningful for you. If you really like animals, do you call the Humane Society and see how you can help? One example of volunteering like that, without being able to go into the Humane Society safely, could look like I have a rescue dachshund. And so the Oregon Dachshund Rescue, they have a ton of volunteers who never, we've got volunteers that live up in Washington and actually serve this rescue, but they'll do like online auctions for the rescue, or they'll do calls, or they'll, do research that the rescue needs, or, accounting or things like that. So think about the things that you're good at, think about the things that interest you, or things that you're passionate about, and find a way to get involved. And then this last point is very, very important and very relevant during today's situation, which is making sure that we utilize technology if mobility or transportation are barriers, or if you're in the middle of a pandemic. So if you've got a smartphone, a tablet, laptop, desktop computer, if you're not sure how to use those things in ways that can keep you connected, pretty much all of those devices at this point either have Skype or FaceTime, or the ability to log on like what we're doing today, be able to view and hear someone else and interact over things like Zoom, GoToMeeting, all these digital platforms where we can stay connected. The next recommendation is to make sure that you continue to move your body throughout the entire lifespan. So the whole concept of like, if you don't use it, you lose it, is true for the brain, it's true for every other part of the body. And we know that if we maintain good physical exercise and movement, I try not to say the word exercise at all, because it doesn't have to be that you try to go to the gym or that you train for running a marathon. It just means moving. So if you want to do some exercises or stretches in your home, if you want to walk, if you want to dance, whatever it looks like, moving your body is all you need to do. So we know that increases in activity help reduce inflammation within the brain and also may reduce the plaques in the brain. So I'm referring to amyloid plaques in the brain, and amyloid plaques are what builds up in the brain when someone is experiencing Alzheimer's disease. So it might help that little cleaning crew go in and help clear some of those out or reduce the buildup of those. The next piece is that it also promotes the birth of new neurons or new nerve cells within the hippocampus in the brain. The hippocampus is one of the places where Alzheimer's disease does its dirty work. And so promoting that extra reserve, like we talked about before, can be really, really great as a protective thing that you can do in not getting Alzheimer's disease. Some of the side effects or potential benefits that you might get out of it if you make sure that you're very active is that you might experience improved mood and you might sleep better. The more worn out you are, it's just like if you've ever raised a puppy or a child. If you take them to the park, if you walk them, if you exercise them, okay, and let them play, move around a bunch, you generally sleep better. And we feel better because we also, when we move around, we release a lot of endorphins in our brain, and it helps us feel better. So the thing to keep in mind is that if possible, you want to have a combination of aerobic, resistance, and strength activities. So it's easier to do if you go to a gym because they can help define, what exercise and types of exercises are involved in each of those categories. But you just want to think about how to keep a good balance. So weightlifting versus aerobic, where that's going to be exercises that are more cardio focused. Strength activities, if you've got bands and things like that, you can do resistance and strength activities. So just having a good combination. The nice thing about that too is that if you have a lot of different options that cover those different areas of activities, it will also help prevent you from getting bored. Okay, so if you only do one thing, like I pretty much for exercise, I mostly just run. So sometimes that makes it harder if I get into a rut because I can get bored of that. Or sometimes if the weather isn't playing nice, I don't have a lot of backup activities that I'm interested in. So think about all the different things that you enjoy. If you've ever been curious about different types of exercise activities, maybe look into that. You have plenty of time probably during the pandemic to do research and figure out what things might work well for you. And then the option, as long as you're socially distanced, right, and wearing masks, you can start a walking group with friends. That way you're kind of getting more benefits out of it because you're combining that social interaction with also moving your body. We've all heard the age-old adage, you are what you eat. It is real. So a healthy diet is one that reduces neuroinflammation in the brain, okay? We also know that the heart and the brain are very much connected. So whatever you're doing to promote brain health is going to also be heart healthy and vice versa. So eating a diet that is heart healthy is also neuroprotective. And we know that brain healthy diets help to preserve brain volume. So if you think back many, many slides ago when I talked about normal age-related changes with the brain, the very first bullet point talked about losing volume within certain parts of the brain. Okay, if you've ever looked at images post-mortem, and they compare a very young brain to a very old brain. You'll just see, even if both brains are very healthy, you'll notice that one is smaller than the other. And that's due to that decrease in volume. So one of the best types of diets to preserve brain health is called the Mediterranean diet. And it is exactly what it sounds like. It's the diet that we see in most Mediterranean cultures. It involves a lot of vegetables, some fruits, legumes, whole grains, a lot of olive oil. Olive oil is a nice one, and then fish and poultry. We get a lot of our omegas from that. And the fish and poultry is recommended because it's heart healthy. So you get your omegas out of that, but it's just leaner meat. It's easier for our bodies to process, and we know that there's less inflammation with fish and poultry than there is going to be with red meat. And then wine in moderation. So for anyone who loves wine, you're lucky it's included. Obviously, the in moderation is in there because as we age, we don't process our alcohol as efficiently as when we're younger. So you can just Google and do a search for Mediterranean diet. It's not a fad thing. It's not a weight loss thing. If you switch to a Mediterranean diet, you probably will become very healthy. You probably will lose weight if you've got any extra weight on you. It's a very, very clean diet. If you need any more resources on that, you can reach out to Bernadette and I can provide some resources for you too. So we are all finished. I want to make sure that people who are going to book club have enough time to transition.